Well, good evening to all of you, and welcome to a very special night here at the Naval Academy. Tonight, each of us will have the opportunity to honor and reflect on the service, work, thoughts, and words of a distinguished naval officer, a great American, Vice Admiral James Stockdale. Admiral Stockdale is a 1947 graduate of this institution who served for 37 years on active duty. Most of those years were as a carrier-based fighter pilot. 10 of those years were associated with the conflict in Southeast Asia. Admiral Stockdale was shot down flying an F-8 Crusader as the Carrier Air Group Commander over North Vietnam in 1965, spent the ensuing 7.5 years as a prisoner of war, the senior Naval Service POW. For his heroic actions during that time, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After his return from Southeast Asia and his promotion to Admiral, he served as the president of our Naval War College in Newport. During that time, he instituted a course on ethics, a course that we modeled our course here at the Naval Academy after. Admiral Stockdale retired from active duty in 1982 as a result of his wounds from Vietnam. He then became an educator and a scholar. And we're all as rich for that service as we were for his heroic service in uniform. And talking to his lovely wife, Sybil, tonight, all of his 4 sons, their 4 sons, are now in the education business. That's also a wonderful legacy, Admiral. Tonight, we get to honor this very special man and to reflect on his thoughts, words, and service. I'll now introduce Dr. Pierce, who will give us the format for the evening. But before I do, I'd ask you to join me in another warm welcome for Vice Admiral and Mrs. James B. Stockdale.
Thank you, Admiral Ryan. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure for the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics to have as the second in our lecture series Vice Admiral Stockdale. We're going to do something a little bit untraditional this evening, and I will walk you through the sequence of events. We're going to begin with a videotape documentary that the Stockdales kindly lent us, which runs about 20 minutes. I had the chance to see it the other day, and I think it does a marvelous job of setting the context for the time and the place in which this man and his brother POWs served with such distinction. After the videotape, I will introduce in sequence 2 of his brother POWs, who will offer some reflections on the theme for this evening, which is moral courage, an evening in honor of Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale. After they have had a chance to offer their reflections, Admiral Stockdale and I will come to the stage and sit on these 2 chairs here, and we will have what he and I call a conversation. And we will draw upon some of the issues that are important to him, some of the questions that came from midshipmen who are now taking NE 203, and from some of the faculty and staff who teach that. That's the sequence of events, and we'll begin with the videotape. Thank you very much.
Hanoi, 1966. We knew them as American prisoners of war. But to the North Vietnamese, they were war criminals. Many were tortured, and some died there of malnutrition. But few were treated more harshly than this man. Admiral James Bond Stockdale was a POW in Hanoi for 7.5 years. Some say he was the most tortured American in captivity. He spent over 4 years in an isolated cell in leg irons, where his captors twisted and broke his already broken leg. Years later, Admiral Stockdale would receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry while in a prison camp. At the cost of great personal agony, Stockdale created a dangerous prison underground and established a code of conduct among fellow POWs that frustrated the North Vietnamese. His goal, survival with dignity.
From the time I pulled that handle and was in that parachute, I was committed to several things, and coming home alive was one of them.
Stockdale was an only child with limited physical aptitude, but he learned to make up for his small size with sheer force of will.
I said, I am not going to be a sissy, and I am going to make the football team.
At the urging of his father, Stockdale entered the Naval Academy at Annapolis, the class of 1947, where he would once again have to prove himself. One of his classmates was the future president, Jimmy Carter. The yearbook noted that James Earl Carter rarely studied, but was still at the top of his class. Of Stockdale, it said that he worked hard and played hard, adding it would be a lucky man to find himself on the China station with Stock.
In my mind, I was the world's best fighter pilot. I was a man of modern technology. I really loved my work. I'll, in all honesty, say that I preferred to be out there flying combat to anything else.
The Gulf of Tonkin, 1964. Stockdale is assigned as Crusader Squadron Commander on the USS Ticonderoga. Tensions with the North Vietnamese are at an all-time high. Reports reach the Ticonderoga that North Vietnamese PT boats have attacked a nearby American destroyer. Stockdale's Crusader Squadron goes into action, and Stockdale himself sinks to the enemy vessel. After news of a second PT boat attack, President Johnson orders American planes to bomb bases in North Vietnam. Now there is no turning back.
But let no one doubt for a moment that we have the resources and we have the will to follow this course as long as it may take.
Reporters interviewed the leader of that first retaliatory airstrike, James Bond Stockdale.
The coordination was worked out. I was able to see the planes as we approached the targets, and the attack from a professional aviator's viewpoint could hardly be improved upon.
Within 6 months, America would embark on a bombing strategy of unprecedented magnitude. At its height, Operation Rolling Thunder would involve over 12,000 missions per month, with pilots often flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. Stockdale's next assignment was to the USS Oriskany, a key carrier in the Rolling Thunder plan. By now, he had more flying time in the supersonic F-8 than any man in the world. This footage was taken by Stockdale himself on a bombing raid. Stockdale earned the respect of his men by refusing to sit behind a desk when his required number of missions had been met.
We flew the attacker aircraft with us. He was not one to sit back and let somebody else carry the load. He did his share and then some.
Captain Harry Jenkins served under Stockdale on the Oriskany. He would later share a cell with him in a Hanoi prison camp.
He seemed to have an insight into things that other people didn't have. For example, on our way to Vietnam, he got all the pilots together and he went over the code of conduct with us and made it very plain that if any of us went down or shot down, that the code of conduct would apply.
September 9th, 1965. Stockdale, a little tired, makes final preparations for what was to be an important bombing raid over North Vietnam. In less than 2 hours, his plane would be shot down. He was 41 years old and would spend the rest of his 40s in tiny prison cells, wearing leg irons and enduring the infamous torture rooms of the Hanoi Hilton prison camp. Lo prison, Vietnamese for fiery furnace, later nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by the POWs. James Von Stockdale spent nearly 8 years in leg irons here. More than 4 years of that time would be in isolation.
It became obvious after a while of living alone that if you didn't want to become an animal, you had to organize your life in some way. Now, this may seem like a strange thing to be in a little bit of a box in a pair of leg irons and to organize one's life, but I learned to do push-ups and leg irons. These were traveling. I did exercises, and of course I had a ritualistic period in the day when I prayed, and that became kind of an obligation.
While Stockdale learned to cope with life in prison, his fellow pilots from the Oriskany continued Operation Rolling Thunder. Harry Jenkins was flying 2 missions a day until November 13th, 1965, the day his plane was shot down. He too was brought to Lo prison, where he experienced the same system of torture that awaited all new arrivals.
Well, they tied me up in such a way that my limbs, my arms lost all the blood. My hands were dark, had turned dark. The fingers wouldn't move when I moved them. My legs were in irons, waited to cut my ankles like a pair of scissors. And they just left you to hurt.
After 4 days of brutality, Jenkins finally broke down and gave his captors information about his missions. Only then was he transferred to the main cell block. Racked with guilt over being broken, he discovered that Stockdale was in the next cell.
He was the first person who was able to get in touch with me, contact me after I was thrown in with the group or in a different cell block. And when I told him that I'd been broken and this sort of thing, his words were, "Welcome to the club," which told me so much, that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't going to be shut out, that he understood.
It was extremely dangerous for prisoners to actually speak to one another. Instead, Stockdale taught them a tap code that dated back to the Civil War. He used this code to issue orders and direct the actions of the prisoners.
You throw out the letter K, and you've got a 25-letter alphabet. If I put a C where a K should be, the guy's going to be able to figure out what I got. A is 1-1, and I know that 4-3 is S. To get practical about it, we had to have a call-up. We soon learned that the best way to call up an American was to give him a very traditional American signal, which is the shave and the haircut. What do you do when you hear that? You rush the wall and you go, 2 bits. So that was natural. So if I were going to talk to the guy at the other end of the building, I could probably raise him by a big thump with the heel of my hand. And if he was alert and it was during a quiet period, I would hear back. If, on the other hand, I had access to the peephole, I could see the shadow under the door, I knew where the guard was, and I wanted to talk surreptitiously and rapidly to the man next door, I might have the convention of using the cup even for that, because we could tap. And then I'd get it back. You know what I just sent him? Hi, H-I. And then he would give, and then I would say, R, the letter R, U, okay.
We would communicate sometimes just for the sake of communicating. When there was a new guy would come in, we'd get his name and so forth and what the war was going on. And we had people who, having run out of other things, would tell us what TV shows were in color, what was no longer on. They'd tell us about movies that we'd missed. Just the ability to communicate was a very, very important thing. And I think without that, had they really been successful in isolating us from each other, many of us would have not survived.
Harry Jenkins almost didn't survive. He was dying of malnutrition when Stockdale and other fellow prisoners went to his aid.
And I had a very severe stomach ache of some sort. And there was no position I could sit in that would ease that pain. And I asked the guards for morphine, and they would give you nothing. And I finally was hurting so badly that I asked them, just shoot me. And in the middle of the night, I wanted some relief or something, and I hollered bow cow for the guard, and no one came. And so the camp, there were 11 of us in this camp, picked this up, and it created quite a stir. Everybody was hollering. And the Admiral took the brunt of this. He was accused of orchestrating this thing, and they removed him from the camp and gave him some pretty harsh treatment.
As senior ranking officer of some 300 American prisoners at the Hanoi Hilton, Stockdale bore the heaviest burden of torture. In one session, his already broken leg was twisted and rebroken by his captors. Today, almost 20 years later, Admiral Stockdale is retired from the Navy, but he remembers the details of his torture sessions as if they happened yesterday.
Their response is to come in, lock you in leg irons. But these have a long bar, they're heavy, and then amid lots of clamor, some slappings to the face, huzzas from a crowd that gathers, 2 torture guards will normally emerge, specially trained men, and start cinching your arms together with the manila rope. And then he climbs on your back, forcing you flat into a V shape, stands on your back, and then gets more leverage as he pulls your shoulders together to the point where you think your shoulders are going to touch, and all the time conscious of the fact that you have numb arms, which if you've done it before, memory tells you will mean that you will not be able to tie your pajama pants for weeks or months, depending upon the amount of minutes these limbs are drained of blood. And then he adds the fillip by taking his heel and pushing your head down between your feet, totally jackknifed, where you start panicking, choking, maybe vomiting because of claustrophobia. At some point along here, with claustrophobia, blood circulation stoppage, and arms distended into unnatural, painful configurations, there comes a time when you submit.
These are North Vietnamese propaganda films. Many prisoners were forced, through torture, to appear in them.
The people who rescued, who captured me, treated me fairly.
Carolyn, I love you. They're treating me well. Merry Christmas, Dick.
You won't see Stockdale in these films because he bloodied his face each time they were to be taken. While he didn't ask the same of his men, he did insist that all prisoners go through a period of resistance before giving in to the demands of their captors. And that usually meant torture.
This was a method of command in which he wasn't setting goals that people could not reach. He understood that all people aren't equal. Some are stronger than others, and he took that into account.
Make them work for it. That is the slogan. Make them hurt you. Never leave that room in that torture situation unless you can say to yourself, I made them earn their pay.
Almost 900 families, wives and families of the missing
Sybil
and captured
Stockdale did
American
not know if her
servicemen
husband was alive or
who
dead for over
Washington
8 months
would
after
send
he was
the
reported
tribute
missing.
that was
As her
spearheaded by
husband became the
Senator
leader of the men in
Dole,
prison,
and it was a
she
tribute
became the
to
leader of the
prisoners of war
POW
and
wives,
taken action
spearheading a
in
campaign for the
South
release of the
Asia.
captured men.
The first Christmas Eve was really a very, very, very bad time for me after I got all the Christmas Santa Claus presents under the tree. And I reminded myself that no matter whether Jim was here or not, that whatever memories were made were the memories that the boys were going to have of Christmases in the future. So I kind of gave myself a talking to and said, you know, you must treat this like a business, that you're in the business of making memories for little boys. And we're going to do this as well as we possibly can. And that helped a lot.
On rare occasions, prisoners were allowed to exchange letters with their families. Stockdale took advantage of these occasions to reassure his wife and send her his confidence and love. In a 1978 interview, Sybil Stockdale read one of her favorite letters from her husband.
This one was written. My darling, Sib, please know how much I miss and love Stan, Jimmy, Sid, and little fellow Taylor. Also know that I love you most of all. Sib, I pray that you know of my pride in you and of my faith and confidence in your judgment in all matters. Your rearing of our 4 wonderful sons is a magnificent achievement. Tell them of my pride and confidence in them. God bless you all this Christmas season. Love, Jim.
I think another great obligation that I felt I must preserve the flame for was the love of the family. Sybil's dignity and motherhood and guts and rectitude demanded nothing less. I had to come home in the way that would make my family proud.
In January of 1973, an agreement between the United States and the Republic of North Vietnam was signed. The war was over, and the prisoners were going home. Seen here moments before boarding a plane home, some prisoners are getting their first glimpse of freedom in over 7 years. Prisoners like Harry Jenkins and James Bond Stockdale. San Diego, February 15th, 1973.
They took me right to the microphone. There was no hugging and kissing before the speech. The speech was the thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, Captain James Stockdale. We're so glad to be home. Our thoughts have been with you ever since we left, and they're going to be with you from now on. For just an instant, permit me to let my thoughts turn inward, however. Inward to these wonderful Americans with whom I've been in prison. I'm proud of their performance. We've fought together, we've laughed together, we've cried together, and we've prayed together. Thank you.
After nearly 8 years in captivity, James Bond Stockdale was home. The children he had left were now young men, and the America he lived in had changed. But friends, family, and the United States Navy would soon learn that they hadn't heard the last of this heroic man. The prisoners were home, and for a while they became the spokesman of post-war heroism in America.
I had a regimen of some 300 push-ups a day, at least in the last couple of years. Harry Jenkins on my left here had the dubious honor of sitting on a bench under which I propped my legs as I did a couple of hundred sit-ups.
I remember just a few weeks before we were allowed to come home, they came in with a sports magazine of some sort, and there's a Green Bay Packer stuffing his hair into his helmet. And, you know, this just isn't the way it is, but it was.
The only thing I remember really finding disturbing was the noise level of the country. It seemed like after all these years of silence that there was a lot of unnecessary racket, not only from mechanical conveyances, but particularly from people. I called it the big wide world of yakety-yak.
Stockdale had hoped to get his own ship, but with the damage to his leg, it was not to be. Yet he was named 3-star admiral and made president of the Naval War College in Maryland.
How good men die.
He took the opportunity to challenge the popular assumption that if you simply act tough enough as a prisoner of war, your captors will give up and leave you alone.
That's not true. There's no way. They are just as energetic and just as determined and just as aggressive against the toughest as the weakest 8 years after you get there.
When he retired from the Navy in 1979, Stockdale was the most decorated member, wearing 26 personal combat medals, including the Congressional Medal of Honor. Today, Stockdale is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. In writing about his Vietnam experience, he deals with the universal human issue, how to persevere through hard times with courage and dignity. This was the central theme of a book that he wrote with his wife, Sybil, about how they survived their ordeal. It was later made into a television movie.
We, I think, have had a great experience in living a life without regrets, now that I'm home.
Since his return from Vietnam, Captain Jenkins has retired from the Navy and works with a top defense contractor. He lives with his wife in San Diego, only a few blocks from the Stockdales. Jenkins says that friendship and trust were the keys to survival among fellow prisoners.
People who've been in combat together form some sort of a bond that they would not have ever formed otherwise, no matter how much they knew of each other or spent with each other, because they've shared, I guess you just lived on the bitter edge together, and you can't talk about it or understand it unless you've been there.
When comradeship ran so high and there was such an affection for each other among us guys who were victims of this thing, I thought to myself, you know, I wouldn't be anywhere else. I'm right where I should be.
Admiral Stockdale will never forget being a prisoner in Vietnam, for he still bears the scars of all those years of pain and torture. But if a hero is a man of great strength and courage, then this man surely deserves the admiration and gratitude of his countrymen. From the darkness of a lonely prison cell, he preserved the flame of the American spirit. And in doing so, he has given us the rarest of gifts, a legacy of American heroism we can all be proud of.
On August 27th, 1966, Lieutenant Commander Jack Fellows, United States Naval Academy class of 1956, was shot down over North Vietnam. Later, Admiral Jeremiah Denton would praise him as one of the toughest men in prison. Part of his toughness was an undying sense of humor. And on one occasion, he apparently convinced a North Vietnamese interrogator that John Wayne was a pilot in his squadron, but had refused combat duty and was ordered by the Pentagon to remain in the United States. Please join me in welcoming back home Captain Jack Fellows.
Thank you. If you'll notice in the program that they handed you out, my name appears in front of Bob Shumaker's. Bob and I are classmates, and this is the first time it has ever appeared in front of Bob Shumaker's name. On August 26th, in my stateroom, I received a secret message which was to be eaten and devoured. The message was from the class of 1956. It said, quote, "Find Bob Shumaker." I launched off the Constellation the next day flying a Grumman A-6 aircraft and found, much to my dismay, that Grumman has never built an airplane that can fly without a right wing. Within 12 days, I had found Bob Shumaker. I might tell you, Bob, they never sent anybody to find me. I'm very touched to be in this crowd, Dave Hoffman and Bob Shumaker, and of course, Admiral Stockdale. It's sort of interesting because there is a great bond between all of us. I was kidding Jim tonight, Admiral Stockdale and I, said that they're looking for someone to say some nice things about him, but they couldn't find anybody, so they called me. How ridiculous that is, huh? First, I'd like to challenge one statement that has been made that a lot of POWs are making. I guess it's sort of, I don't know what the hell it's for. A lot of POWs are saying that they were broken. I have never served with a POW who was broken. I have served with POWs who were bent, but never broken. I never saw a POW who did not go back and ask for more from the Vietnamese. And that was part of it because of the leadership of Admiral Stockdale. We gave them all we could give them. We fought them constantly. I never, again, have seen a POW who was broken. So when you hear it, just say, I got to talk about. He's bent maybe, but not broken. When I got there, I also found Admiral Stockdale and the great leadership that was involved in that system. And it reminded me of a statement that General Shepard made when he was Commandant of the Marine Corps in the release of the Korean POWs, when he said this: "In the struggle against communism, the war is no longer over when a man is forced to yield. The POW stockade is only extension of the battlefield where they must be taught to carry on an unequal struggle with the only weapons remaining to them, faith and courage." And from faith and courage, which we all had a little bit of, we were able to glean it from others, such as Admiral Stockdale, Bob Shumaker, and the rest. It was an amazing situation because where they thought they had us, they never did. We used to say, as we were living in the camp called the zoo, that it was strange to see the people looking out at the animals. A sense of humor was absolutely mandatory in that environment. I don't know how we could have survived without it. I have been involved with situations that today seem so funny and so ridiculous, and at the time they were also funny and ridiculous. I tried not to laugh at them, although I was accused once of laughing, and the door was closed. I was not allowed to bathe for 11 days in the summer because I had the audacity to laugh. What I gleaned from you, Admiral, I can't even describe it. They gave me 10 minutes to do this, but I can't do it in 10 minutes, so I just won't try. You know how I feel about you, and the rest of the world knows how I feel about them. If you want a leader, don't go to the total quality leadership. Don't go to TQM. Don't go to a pill. Go to somebody who leads by example, and that's what it's all about. Get that lead by example in there first, and all those other things will fit into place, like TQM. So every time I looked over at Admiral Stockdale, and there were others that led, there was a guy that was the first one out to take the beatings, and they liked to beat the senior ranking officers first. And there's Jim taking his beatings. I tell you, it's very hard not to follow in his footsteps and do the best you can in taking beatings. God bless you, Admiral Stockdale.
On February 11th, 1965, Lieutenant Commander Robert Shumaker, United States Naval Academy class of 1956, became the second American taken captive in North Vietnam. Admiral Denton called him brave but not foolhardy, and slicker than anyone in inventing new ways to communicate. So good at communication, he was often referred to by his brother POWs as our anchor man. Please join me in welcoming back home Rear Admiral Bob Shumaker.
Thank you very much, and Admiral Mrs. Ryan, and Admiral Mrs. Crow, and Admiral Mrs. Stockdale, and other distinguished guests, but most of all, midshipmen. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to appear tonight and give you some of my personal thoughts about the role of ethics in the military, and to introduce the main speaker. You know, I can remember lectures such as this some 40 years ago where Jack Fellows and I sat where you are after a long day of classes. So I know how you must feel, and we'll try to make it harmless for you tonight. But we three speakers must look like a bunch of old men to you, and we represent collectively 22 years of imprisonment. Jack Fellows and I, you know, are classmates and close friends, and Admiral Stockdale is out of the class of 47. But you know, each of us, each of the three of us would give anything to be where you are tonight. Healthy, about to start your careers, idealistic, and out of debt. But we can't do that, of course. All we can do is talk to you about our experiences, the things that we did right, and some of the pitfalls that we overcame. Now, I'd like to observe that the practice of teaching ethics at the Academy is not new. It just wasn't always as formalized as it is now. Our instructors and company officers and commandants and superintendents were carefully chosen to be role models for the brigade. And in my time, they started a course on leadership, and it was a non-credit course. It was held in the basement of Bancroft Hall, next to some boilers that were always noisy, and taught by a company officer. Well, you can imagine the groans when the head shed laid that trip on us. But you know, as I reflect over my own career, that low-key course probably had more impact on me than any differential equation I ever tackled or physics theorem that I addressed. Our emphasis then was to stress engineering and science, and our quest was for precision and exactness and speed. You know, we learned that X equals 7.23 or something like that. You see, that was all our slide rules could generate at that time. But in this leadership course, we were exposed, perhaps for the first time, to the case study method, and in which some situation involving human interaction was presented, and our task was to analyze all the elements and then to discuss possible courses of action. And at the end of the hour, we'd turn to our instructor, the company officer, and say, "So what's the correct solution, sir?" And it really bothered me initially that oftentimes there was no correct solution. And the value of the discussion was that we learned that solutions are variable and dependent and often not very precise. My instructor was a Marine captain, and he was even then a legend. We clandestinely called him Bonzo for reasons that I won't elaborate. But to this day, I'm very grateful to him, he's now deceased, for his example of leadership and ethics, the two of which, as I'm sure you know, are inexorably intertwined. Another example of leadership during my days came from further on down the line. There was a rather colorful chief petty officer named Shorty who was assigned to the seamanship department, and his succinct advice, delivered in a rather salty and profane style, was, "You guys get out there and learn your stuff, and also be careful who you marry." Well, paraphrasing him out of respect for his widow, I'd say that you really need to become an expert in something, in at least one field, in order to command the respect of the people with whom you'll be associated. And you have to be careful in choosing your associates, you know, wives or friends or whatever, because they can very strongly influence you both beneficially and detrimentally. I suppose that people have struggled with the definition of leadership for a long time, and especially with what role ethics should play in leadership. I like to keep it simple. My definition of ethics is simply doing the right thing. Doing the right thing, no matter what the personal consequences might be. But it's not always easy to do the right thing when human traits such as greed and bias and impatience or avoidance of blame or the need for public adoration play into the equation. It's not always easy to take a firm stand when you know that it's going to cost you your friends or money or physical pain. We had a lot of good leaders in our POW camp, and Jack Fellows, my classmate, is a good example of it. Jack specialized, as was said earlier, in covert communications, and he always maintained a high spirit, which was always contagious. Now let me tell you a little bit about the main speaker tonight. He's a soldier, a scholar, a sailor, a statesman, and his name is Stockdale. You know, if his first name had been Sam, we'd have perfect alliteration here, but it's not. It's Jim. And he came off an Illinois farm to join the star-studded class of '46, which produced a president, a chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, senator, and others. He played some football at the academy, as we saw in the film, and learned that life itself is a contact sport. He spent the mandatory year at sea before flight training and then held a variety of jobs as a fighter pilot. He graduated from the Patuxent Test School and then stayed on as an instructor and was known for his unusual method of keeping the class's attention. I'm sure you can sympathize with your classmates whose eyelids sometimes droop after a class or in class after a heavy lunch. That used to be the case at Patuxent also, until Lieutenant Stockdale pulled out his .38 revolver filled with blanks, and that ended any drowsiness. Admiral Stockdale's epiphany came as a graduate student at Stanford. His 2-year curriculum in international relations was jam-packed with course requirements. And with just one course elective, he decided to study philosophy. Philosophy? Well, now, hotshot fighter pilots just don't do that sort of thing. But actually, they should. Because this exposure strongly influenced Lieutenant Commander Stockdale, and later, through him, affected some 500 POWs and 1,000 or so War College graduates and countless others who read the Naval War College Review. He continues to influence the American political scene today with his views on ethics and morality. His mentor at Stanford was Professor Reinhardt. Once gave him a pamphlet to read and study, which he did with some consternation and puzzlement. It was about a Roman general named Epictetus, who came from very humble origins to become a revered leader and who epitomized the meaning of ethics as it relates to military leadership. Those of us who know Admiral Stockdale call him CAG. That was a term we used up until about 1960 for the guy who's in charge of all the squadrons on an aircraft carrier, Commander Air Group. And in this case, it's a term of endearment. As CAG, as was said before, he was shot down over North Vietnam in 1965, badly injured, as you saw, captured and spent 7.5 years there. And throughout those years, he was Epictetus incarnate. The Vietnamese tried to break and humiliate him as the senior POW, but he resisted with every fiber in his body and set the example for the rest of us to follow. Through it all, he never relinquished his responsibility to lead, to encourage, and to maintain everyone's morale. His motto to all of us in Hanoi was, "Back U.S." The individual letters of which stood for, don't bow to them, stay off the air, don't confess, don't kiss them goodbye, and finally, united we stand, back U.S. It helped me and helped Jack and many others get through that ordeal intact. He's a man who knows how to do it right. One of the most ethical people I know, my friend, CAG Stockdale. Thank you.
Admiral Stockdale said to me earlier today when I went over the program with him, he said, well, look, the theme is ethics, and if Fellows and Shumaker get to say a few words about me, then it's only fair that I get to say a few words about them. Admiral?
Well, I was overwhelmed, Jack and Bob, and I just want to tell the crowd that I have nicknames for both of them, and these are my heartfelt nicknames. Jack Fellows, salt of the earth. One thing he didn't talk about was when he was locked up with a couple of other fellows in Heartbreak Hotel, and the obvious job was how to take care of 3 other prisoners who were somewhere on the road to insanity. And he has compassion and did the best he could. And he couldn't get them to, you know, they wanted to be left alone. They'd left this world. And that was a kind of a job that Bob could do, or Jack could do, that very few of us could. He saw some people in straits that none of us have ever seen the like of. I saw one of these guys. He was a lieutenant commander, and he was 6'4", and they would take him out into the courtyard. I had a peephole, and he was so out of it that he would stoop over and he would look at the Vietnamese faces, because they had secretarial help, and this was the prison headquarters, and others in this courtyard and they would avert their gaze because it made them feel so uncomfortable. And so I just wanted to set that, there's that side of Jack Fellows nobody could duplicate. And old Bob, I would say Jack fell the salt of the earth, and Bob Shumaker, the brains of the outfit. All this thing about communication and all, he was a co-inventor of. He set up a whole procedure for the thing. He was interested in all sorts of science. He's got, of course, a PhD and was president of the PG school. And so I'm just going to leave it there. You guys really did me proud, and I wouldn't trade you for anybody in the world for friends. Thank you.
Admiral, when you and I discussed this, I told you that I think the most common question that anyone who has not been through what you've been through, I think begins with, once you're taken captive and you know you are captive, what do you go through? Do you think you're going to go crazy?
Well, each case is so different. It depends on how bashed up you are. And it's when you get that resolved and get what hospitalization you're going to get, that then you're usually put in later into torture and then put in isolation. And there's the time when you've got to face up to yourself. And are you going to go crazy? I say no such luck. You've got to get used to yourself, and you've got to discipline yourself to make your life, your activities, part of a regimen, a coordinated thing. You don't just lie there and wait for somebody to open the door to get up. You got things to do. You've got to remember all the names you are keeping from all these prisoners and go over that list. You've got to go over the list of your whereabouts in the past. Keep a record of what so that your day is full. There's communication time during the noon hour usually, and that has to be done. And there are all these things. I remember being in a little cell in a place we called Alcatraz about 4 in the afternoon, and here came the guy with the leg irons. And I said, oh my God, I'd been up since 6 doing these things. And I said, I haven't had a second to myself all day. And here he comes.
People want to know also, I think, when you're in that situation where almost everything is out of your control, what really makes you vulnerable to the captors? Is it pain? Is it fear? Is it shame? What is it that makes you vulnerable?
Well, your vulnerability, I kind of encapsulated, is fear and guilt. And you seem, by guilt, I don't mean guilt in the direct sense. I mean you feel guilty because you didn't do as well at the last torture session as you thought you had it in you. And fear is just a part of the equipment because but you can, you get so you're not enveloped in those things. And this comes with confidence in yourself. And I just described 3 people who really were over the hill, but they were about the only ones, and everybody else was, after a while, not content, but not continually upset. You knew what the odds were. I mean, you were facing a tough time, but you don't lose your ability to think and to plan and to take some time to pray for your family, and you come to live a life that you could exist with for years and years.
It seems that the circumstances there drive you into yourself and to think about your situation and where you are. What pulls you out of that? What keeps you going? What pulls you out from being obsessed with your own personal individual situation?
Well, you have to be a little bit selfish. I mean, proud of yourself. That's a big time. When you say, I'm doing okay, I'm going to make it. I don't think this is casting any, this is a natural reaction, and I think that was more the common case than the person that's just at bay. He takes the part of a prisoner. He plays well the given part. He knows you're not to blab. He knows you're not to betray the trust of others. This was the more common case in our situation. The worst tragedies I talked about were those that Jack was talking about. And then there was another couple. There's some flagrant violators of kind of for selfish ways, and these I can count on my 2 fingers, that should have been punished and weren't. And they were both senior officers. Both of them were 05s. And they both sort of divorced themselves from the prison. And they were picked up by the Vietnamese and put in special places. I don't know why that happened. I filed charges against them, and the first 4 charges on each sheet were capital offenses, mutiny, so forth. But the Secretary of the Navy, John Warner, decided that they should be patted on the hand and let go. And I can live with that, but these are worst cases.
In your speeches, one of the phrases that you use over and over again is one familiar to people in the room, although not in that circumstance, my brother's keeper.
Well, that occurs to you when the man next door is sick, or he's got troubles, he's at home. We all said that. I am my brother's keeper. That's your most important job for the time, is to make sure that you contact him daily, and you don't try to give him your philosophy of life. That doesn't work in those isolated circumstances. The last thing he wants to hear is your philosophy of life. He's got all these ducks in line. He's got a program. They're working well enough. So don't preach to him, but tell him let him know you are worried about him and you're pulling for him.
You've spoken in the past eloquently, and I'll use your words about loyalty to the group. I have a reputation to uphold with them. I can't let them down. They are my country. They are my family.
Well, I certainly felt that way, and they felt that same way about, including me, too. I think that was a very common conclusion when you take stock of yourself, that we're all in this together, and we're going to get through this together. And loyalty to your shipmates is right up there at the top in the obligations of a fighting man.
You've talked about the problem of the loners, the occasional people who pulled into themselves. What can you do about that? What do you try to do about that?
Well, I think we just talked about some, and sometimes they're beyond layman's capability, the ones I talked about. Usually they're kind of bitter people that for some reason, the ones I know as loners, sort of hate themselves. And the only thing you can do is to do them a favor once in a while and hope they turn around.
In a couple of your speeches, you talk about what do you draw upon and what do you turn into, and you used a line in one of them. You said, so you learn to get up in the morning and say to yourself, God, help me keep my conscience clear.
Well, that's a very high priority item if you lose confidence in yourself. And this means you have to not betray a shipmate, to not to certainly bring harm to somebody else out of selfishness. This is the greatest tonic you can give yourself, is to get up and say, keep my conscience clean. dear God. And that's the route to success.
Success for you and success for many of the other POWs was a function, as Admiral Shumaker and Captain Fellows have already said, of your own leadership. And I was struck in reading a couple of your articles and speeches where you talked about early on your first instinct when new prisoners would come in would be to be a compassionate leader. That we're in this hellacious situation, just do your best and everything will be fine. But they didn't respond well to that.
Well, I don't know that I had much experience with people that were brand new there. I know that there was a core, the community had about 3 focuses, and one was the so-called senior officers, which you could count on several hands. And then the ones that really carried the load were what I call the young Turks, and that would be Bob and Jack. They were a little older than most of them, but they were Orson Swindle. There were these guys that were communicators, that were dedicated. They're the middle grade. They're the captains and the majors, and they carried the communication load particularly. One of the things that you have to do if you're trying to outwit a circumstance like this is get the drop on the commissar. And if you smell a rat coming up the line, like he took me aside one day and he said, now, you know, this was in summer of '67, the Navy and the Air Force were bombing the hell out of that country. We thought by Christmas we'd have the war over until McNamara moved them out about the middle of the fall. There was bomb debris on the streets. The power plants were being put out of commission. The power was down. The water mains were broken. And the commissar came to me and he said, you know, you can take credit for this. I'd like for you to invite your men who are all getting boils. There's no bath water. They can volunteer to be on work details on the streets of Hanoi picking up debris. Well, didn't take me 2 seconds. For every American out there picking up bomb debris, there'd be 5 cameramen on him. And that would be appearing all over the world. And I told him, no, I wasn't interested in that. And that's about where I left it. But I went back to the cell and I put out a message right away to these young Turks who pick it up. Get it out right now. Nobody goes out and works in town. If they get the drop and there becomes a flow and then there are advocates of and enemies against working in town, I've lost the ball game. I've got to get my message to my men from the shoulder and tell them, no, I've thought that through and that's going to backfire on us. And that's the methodology. You have to have coordination and people sensitive enough to know that the importance of speed and communication, so that when they call up people, everybody says that. That's the way it went.
You've written that in some cases, the officers who served with you really demanded leadership from you. They wanted you to tell them what was expected of them.
Well, I think that's a fair enough. I don't remember a lot of this. It got into speech, but anyway, I think that was my responsibility to give them the leadership that would steer them in the direction that we all agreed, I think, was the right course, to stick with America, to stick together, to go down to the wire together, to shoulder the load together. I've talked about, one of the things, this was a floating population, and there would be new commanders that would show up in the middle or later part of the war who were we had a problem of keeping track on seniority in there because the war lasted so long. Pretty soon, you're out flying and you're you're a lieutenant and your wingman is with you. You get shot down, he gets back to the ship, and then 5 years later he shows up and you're still a lieutenant and he's a commander. So we we had to figure out a way to get out of it, and the way we did it, I won't go through it, but when two men are vying for proportionate rank, the date of importance is the day the first guy gets shot down, and everything proceeds from there. If he's senior, he's still senior. Oh boy, well, this can drive you nuts, but we didn't let it worry us too much. People caught on to that, but it could get. But when the new guy does come in and leaving out, and he's a bona fide lieutenant commander, and he's the right man to be the cell block captain, and he's inexperienced and he doesn't know. He's just going through the early torture, and people say, well, let's hear what the new guy's got to say. And usually it was something like this. He said, gentlemen, I just don't understand. It's just a shock to me to come into a situation where we have so many good men being forced to do things that they would never in the world do in the land of freedom. And it's just overwhelming. The sin of that whole thing is overwhelming, and I'm going to ask you, I believe you all deserve to be the manager of your own defensive system. Now, we're starting to float. And then you might close out with a nice thing like, a well-brought-up young American with the best of intentions, say something like, and so I'll be here, and God bless you. Okay. Well, then everything's quiet in the cell block. About 5 seconds later, one of the young Turks come up. Sir, we want to sleep at night. We want our consciences clean. The least you can do is to let us say that we are adhering to the policies of our commanding officer. That's what gives us the drive and the coordinated spirit to move this thing. And when you say that we're to design our own defenses, that's the last thing we want. We want direction from the commander. We want to be known. We want to know and be sure what we take torture for. And there may be 15 or 16 or 20 items. Give us the list. We will not sit here and not complain to a commanding officer who doesn't have the courage to tell us to go to torture. I heard that all the time. That's the way the organism grew. And this guy probably says those guys were right. I had no way. I mean, I was just trying to get out of a job. And I've got responsibility. And so this is the infighting.
You spoke earlier this evening, in fact, about in that circumstance that you developed what you called orders that can be obeyed. What do you mean by that?
One of the first things that I faced off on. So many people, it's so easy to give orders that really can't be obeyed. For instance, the guy that says, okay, here's the orders of the day. Obey the code of conduct. Well, that could be argued in the courtroom for, the guy doesn't know what to do. You've got to give specific orders that everybody can understand, and it all should be involved with the mechanism, its communication, its cohesion, its occasional top-down messages that indicate the pleasure of the top command, if you can be so. The code of conduct, I want to tell you a story that I don't think this is the first time I ever told it. No, almost. When we all got released in the spring of '73, a lot of us got invitations to military bases to give talks or to participate in reunions or whatever. And Sybil and I accepted some of those, and one of them was to the Army War College in Pennsylvania's spring, celebration, you might say. There were good speeches, there were dinner parties every night. We went on 3 or 4 days. And we were in this little area, among others, munching tidbits and having a couple of drinks, when a little guy walked up to me and he said, could I sit with you tonight? And he was a pleasant-looking little fellow. Of course, I said. You dignified? I said, yes, of course. We went over and took our seats. And he stuck out his hands and he said, hello, I'm Slam Marshall, I think I told this. And he said, how'd you get along with that code of conduct? Well, I said, how'd you get along with that name, rank, serial number thing? Well, I said, it was impossible. So we just sort of ignored it. I mean, that was beside the point. Because of the ropes, you're not going to, nobody can sit there like an Indian, and unless you just want to die and have it over with. And he said, I was afraid of that. I said, some of the guys kind of had heart pangs about that. And I'm sure in the whole of the Vietnam War, there were many people. I mean, there were dozens or scores of soldiers and officers who came face to face with the fact that this solemn pledge that they were more or less given, in survival school, there were circumstances where it wasn't even sensible not to talk. He said, well, I wrote that code of conduct, and I went back to the French and all the records. He was a newspaper man. This fellow was a fellow that was a citizen soldier. In the World War I, he was probably second lieutenant out of OCS. In the World War II, he was a colonel. In the Korean War, he was a brigadier general, and Ike Eisenhower was one of his close friends, and he was a well-known person. But he said, I am bound to give only name, rank, serial number, date of birth. And in the formal language, that means I'm obliged to only give those things. The rest of it's up to me. I've got to give name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, or I can be thrown in jail by these people or even punished in court-martial. But the rest of it, nobody ever, he said, it never occurred to me to have that apply to everybody. I mean, all of this was zip-lipped. Well, I said, that's what the common belief was of people that went through survival schools. And he said, well, I went to Ike. I said, why? Now, here's what triggered it. The armed forces, the armed force leaders of all the services started vying for macho position vis-a-vis the others to tell about what little their people could tell anybody. No, in the Army, we're not even, if you're on a diet, you have to have pills, you're not allowed to tell them. If you're in the Coast, everybody was one up. And he said, call these service chiefs in and read them the Riot Act, Ike, because this is going to ruin the whole damn thing. He said he never got around to that, but
you did with orders that can be obeyed.
Huh?
You did with orders that can be obeyed.
Yeah.
You brought that back down.
Well, that's a true story. I don't know whether to try to do something with that. Several things that might be a lesson learned for the next war, because it's plenty to ask a person to tell him, just going in there. The idea that silence is a blessing to a fighter is baloney. You've got to have guile, you've got to be able to tell stories, you've got to be able to tell lies. One time my interrogator Rabbit said, and I didn't, I wasn't looking for writing to do, but he said, I got to get you to write something. So I said, why don't you let me write history? Let me give you a history of the American-Korean War. Okay, he couldn't believe it. So here's what I wrote, and it took, several hours. I said, when the Americans first got into the Korean War, they didn't understand the thing. Here was the United Nations, and they were there in some pose that nobody really understood. And they were disorganized. Now, I'm exaggerating. I was probably telling things that really aren't true. I wasn't trying to tell them the truth. I wanted to tell them what I wanted to tell them. But anyway, but the only thing, the Americans were disturbed because the others were leading their men in battle. And then the only thing that really changed the situation is when they started talking about brainwashing. Now, I don't believe there is such a thing as brainwashing, but I didn't put that in the story. But I said and I said the population rose as one man when they heard that the communist armies were trying to brainwash their sons. And that was the downfall. It was then that we generated power and took over. This is the short version. Well, he took it away, and he didn't, he was a pretty savvy, sophisticated guy, and he thought the whole idea was, he wasn't going to argue with me about that. But I heard the commissar, who'd learned to speak English, outside my window one day, telling a bunch of American visitors, he said, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very strict rule here in Vietnam. We will not brainwash. We will discuss, and we will point out problems with your point of view, but we have never taken up brainwashing. I want you to tell all the people back home. Okay.
Admiral, you once wrote, in your words, you said, the Stoics said character is fate. In my life, education has been fate. And you've also told the story as you were shot down, as you were parachuting down, that you said out loud to yourself, I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. How did a fighter pilot, a test pilot, a master of technology, how did you get to philosophy?
Well, I took it as I was given a book by a professor at Stanford. Have I lost my machine again? I don't know what.
Hold on to it. It'll be
yeah. Okay. I took his philosophy course. I was so sick of my subject that when I really should have gone to postgraduate school was when I was a JG and I could get into aeronautical engineering, but then I got picked up for test pilot school, and Sybil said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm torn, and she said, well, just do what you want to do. And I said, I want to stay here because this is what I would go to school to learn how to do, flight test pilot work. So, but then it was the only course I was eligible for was international relations. Well, I was too old for that. I was, in my late 30s. I'd been systems of government. I'd been beating systems of government for years. What do I want a degree in that for? But anyway, I went through it. And Tony Sokol said, Tony Sokol was an old German, maybe Bill Crow remembers him. He was a political scientist, I think. And he got a voice, and I said, Tony, I'm sick of this stuff. This is kid stuff. I don't need this. And I said, I'd like to go to the philosophy department. He said, don't do it. Not out of loyalty to political science, but he said, you don't realize that you'd have to be there for 3 courses before you know the terminology. So, well, I said, I don't care. I'm going on over there. But I went by, and I was walking down the hall. I noticed they had carpeted floors, and there were a lot of things different about this place. And people had eyes that kind of looked out this way. But I was marching down this hall, and this big voice boomed out, can I help you? And I turned around, I said, yeah. And he said, well, what do you, I already had a little gray hair, and I think he thought it was a problem. And he said, well, what is it you want? I said, I've had 6 years of college, and I've never had a course in philosophy. I'd like to take one. And he said, what is your profession? I said, I'm a naval officer over here in grad school. He said, I was in the Navy in World War II. And he sat me down, and this was a beautiful friendship of a very elegant man, Phil Reitlander. But when we had this last, I had to go over his house for an hour every week. That was golden. I knew graduate students for PhDs that couldn't even get an appointment with their advisor. And we had a lot of good talk. His father had been quite a clergyman. He was a bishop of Pennsylvania, and he had me reading David Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion. And I remember I'd go in there and I would just work it over and over. Well, he'd forgotten to tell me that natural religion is one which will not permit miracles to enter the theology. And even that kind of attracted my attention. But on the basis of that, he said, I want to give you a book to remember me by. I was just going back to sea duty. And he gave me this Enchiridion, the Epictetus book. And this was the Stoic belief that, you know, the Stoics do not believe in afterlife. They do not believe that because that introduces an unknown, miracle is an exception to nature. And for the Stoics, nature is God's body. I mean, you know, it's complicated. But anyway, so I got interested enough in this book that I bought the real one, the big book from which it was an excerpt. And for 3 cruises, flying combat, I made myself read that thing on my bedside table. And I was really catching on to this thing when I got shot down, and that's why Epictetus was on my mind.
You talked about Professor Rhinelander's course on the problems of good and evil, and I guess one of the people you read was Solzhenitsyn, and there was a line from Solzhenitsyn that you used often in talking about your POW experience. And you said Solzhenitsyn wrote, "The line separating good and evil passes not between states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart, through all human hearts." So I guess your reading of philosophy and your reading of literature held you in good stead. As you and I have been talking, trying to get together and get ready for this evening, I realized it would come to an end at some point. And the question I had was, how do you end an evening like this? And I was flipping through your book and came across a speech that you gave in 1994 on Memorial Day on the site of Andersonville, the Civil War prison. And when I read the end of your speech, and you quoted from a poem, and I said, I can't improve on that, so I would like to close this evening reading the poem that you read on that occasion, which you said was found unsigned in a Civil War prison. And this was written well over a century ago, but it could have been written about Vice Admiral Jim Stockdale, or Rear Admiral Shumaker, or Captain Fellows, or Hoffman, or any of their brother POWs. We asked for strength that we might achieve. God made us weak that we might obey. We asked for health that we might do great things. He gave us infirmity that we might do better things. We asked for riches that we might be happy. We were given poverty that we might be wise. We asked for power that we might have the praise of men. We were given weakness that we might feel the need of God. We asked for all things that we might enjoy life. We were given life that we might enjoy all things. We received nothing that we asked for, but all that we hoped for. And our prayers were answered. We were most blessed. Admiral Stockdale, Admiral Shumaker, Captain Fellows, and all of your brother POWs, we want to thank you for the example, the inspiration, the grace, the courage, and the simple, decent honor that you showed during your time. We are all now and forever in the debt of all of you. Thank you very much.
want you to come back. Do I hold this?
Sir, for the last two decades, you dedicated your life to ensuring that military leaders study ethics. And tonight I'm lucky enough to stand up here in front of this crowd and represent over 4,000 midshipmen from your alma mater that are also constantly on a day-to-day basis study ethics. So we felt it only fitting to, in this book here, to take some time to write what ethics and honor mean to us as midshipmen fixing to embark on a career in naval service, and just take some time to write about that in this book. So tonight, on behalf of you spending time with us and the example that you are for all of us, I'd like to present it to you on behalf of the Brigade of Midshipmen, sir. Thank you.
That's wonderful. And Will, we met at dinner, and I know his first name, and I know what's in it. And it is first-person letters from the brigade. And I'll treasure this. Thank you.
Admiral, on behalf of the staff and faculty here at the Naval Academy, we'd like to make a presentation to both you and Sybil. You, in your first book, In Love and War, gave us a wonderful example, one that I hope all the midshipmen here take advantage of and read this book. It tells you that you can be someone who serves your country for nearly 4 decades, and you can still have a beautiful, long, and lasting marriage and a wonderful partnership. In representing that partnership tonight, we have 2 bookends. One for both of you with the beautiful seal of the Naval Academy, and it's inscribed to Vice Admiral Stockdale. Thank you for your lecture tonight. Thank you for all you've done for us. I'll carry this as a steady for you.
Oh, thank you very much, Admiral. And I'm so happy to be back here.
Thank you. We'll think about all of you as we use the bookends. I hope you all will have as wonderful a time in the service as we have had. I know that sounds kind of odd, but I really have loved almost every minute of it. Not every single one, but almost. Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless you.